Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now to your host.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone. My name is Michelle Crimes. I am a program director with CYP's Anti-Corruption and Governance team. And I'm here today with Ellen Berry, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation about crises and about what happens inside an organization when there's pressure and when communication starts to break down. This conversation is part of a series where we've been talking about lessons that democracy organizations can take from the private sector and vice versa. I'm really glad to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ellen.
Great to be here. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Just to give our audience and our listeners a bit of a sense of who you are, I'm just going to read a little bit about your bio so that we know who we're talking with. Ellen Berry has provided strategic advice to C-suite members and boards of directors, navigating crises ranging from cyber attacks to national disasters to financial malfeasance. Working both in-house counsel for Fortune 20 companies and with global consultancies, she has provided high-level crisis counsel, CEO advisory, financial and corporate messaging, employee communication, and community, investor, and government relations. Her work has included outreach to NGOs, nonprofit management, and communication leadership. So if there was anyone who could really help us to bring some of these lessons to bear from the private sector, it's you. You've got this wonderful background where you've had your foot in both worlds, and I think really able to translate some of these issues for everyone. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I want to talk a little bit about operating in increasingly complex environments. Organizations today, and really right now what we're seeing, face this convergence of challenges ranging from geopolitical uncertainty and then regulatory fragmentation and rapidly evolving information and rapidly evolving environments. Over the course of your career, what has changed most as crises emerge and unfold? And where do you see organizations consistently caught off guard?
Well, thanks for letting me provide you with some of my experience from the corporate world. I've done a little bit of nonprofit, so I can hopefully be able to be a little bit more helpful with the nexus. I'd say the single biggest change, and everybody says this, is social media, right? And so it's the quickness with which information is relayed. And then the other thing, as social media has evolved, I'd say that we're now looking at AI and the corresponding information, disinformation, misinformation, what is real, and what elements am I using when I'm making a decision in a very rapidly changing environment. And to that end, the second question that you asked about where do people get caught off guard, I'd say there's kind of two things. One is they're not prepared. And so there's an opportunity today. It's not if a crisis occurs, it's when. You're going to have something that happens that is unexpected as an organization, as a governmental body, as a leadership team. And so you have an opportunity to get yourself prepared. And the other thing that I would say that is probably where people get tripped up the most, and where I do think corporations often get it right, is they have someone who says the buck stops here. I'm going to be the one who makes the decision. I'm going to be the person that is going to speak publicly. They may not be the same people, but you have to have these points of contact and roles and responsibilities very, very clearly defined.
That's really a good insight in terms of what we're thinking of or what you actually see in decisions being made, right? The idea that it's a decision where we're going to accept responsibility or however it might form. One of the things that I thought of as you were speaking is sort of this idea of being ready, because it's not a matter of if, but when. And we've talked a lot in this series about the fact that it takes, a community of private sector actors, perhaps democracy actors coming together and really building trust together. And it's really cited, I think, as one of an organization's valuable asset. Yet it can take years to build the sort of trust between private sector, democracy organization, nonprofit organizations. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about what, from your perspective, that trust and being able to collaborate together during a crisis, what does it look like, and what distinguishes organizations that are really able to build and leverage that trust and those that are not?
So I'd say the key thing is, again, as far as being prepared, you have to build those relationships today. You're not going to be able to, in the same way that people say, oh, well, I don't really need to talk to the press. Well, yeah, you do. Because if you don't have a relationship with a reporter, you don't have a relationship with people that understand your business in the same way. If you don't have a relationship with your governmental regulators, you don't have a relationship with the NGO that may not actually be that kind to your industry, when a crisis happens, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. I think I told you this. I've worked a lot with oil and gas companies, and who, a lot of NGOs don't like. And, oil and gas companies go up and down in their popularity with governmental bodies. But one of the things that I saw was, in a very serious crisis, there was a fellow who his job was to be the liaison to nonprofits that dealt with the environment, that dealt with kind of land management, and that dealt with the community. And when there was this giant crisis, he all of a sudden was the man of the hour because he had these relationships. And so once a settlement was made, for example, after this situation, he was integral to deciding with these NGOs where that settlement money actually would be useful, where it should go. And it was funny because, I was in a boardroom with 45 guys, and all of a sudden all these engineers and operation guys are going, oh, let's talk to the guy that actually has a degree in environmental studies. And he rose to the occasion and was able to be extremely helpful. And I thought that was a great example of, making those connections early. A lot of people do kind of SWOT analysis of the people that don't like them. A corporation will do a SWOT analysis of NGOs that are coming after them, so to speak. But what they should be doing is saying, okay, what are these people's concerns? How can we mitigate them early on? And in the same way, and I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, you need to have a relationship with the mayor, the governor, with, the regulators. And that's, and so I said, the first time you meet someone in Washington, D.C. as a corporate leader, you don't want to be sitting on the other side of a green felt table. Like, that's not where you want to make your introduction as an organization. I'm not necessarily advertising for lobbyists, but I am saying understand who these people are and have relationships with them. A lot of times corporations do community outreach, and that's an opportunity for them to say, hey, we all live here. We all care about our kids. We all care about our community, and you build relationships that way.
Oh, this is great because you're making the exact same point that we started off with in this podcast series, was just that we need to have those relationships. They need to exist prior to the crisis becoming a crisis. And that when you start building that trust long beforehand, it's the sort of thing where you never know where these relationships become, pivotal, and then when they become useful. On our end at SIPE, we'd focus on, working with associations, right? And sort of bringing together associations and strengthening them to be sure that they're critical and so that they're well-placed partners. And so there are lots of stakeholders who we can think about being part of, creating these relationships. So I wanted to ask you a little bit of a question around these stakeholder expectations, because as you've already, mentioned in your great example, there are NGOs, the idea of a SWOT analysis for, the folks who don't like us, right? Where there might be different expectations, but yet communities are sort of demanding this from private sector actors or demanding it from their different nonprofit organizations. I would be really curious to hear from your perspective, how do leaders make a decision as they're trying to work through a crisis, and then they've got all of these sort of conflicting stakeholder sort of expectations?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's the biggest challenge that a leader has in the middle of a crisis. I think I talked to you about this previously, but I was working with a large multinational last year, and they had a very serious crisis, and there was a lot of information coming in from a lot of different arenas and different channels. And what was most interesting to me were there were two channels that we, as their kind of crisis advisor, gave a little bit more credence to. And surprisingly, one of them was the local newspaper, because they had a reporter. It was a small town where this happened, and it was a multinational, but the local newspaper had the relationships with people who worked there, with the local government, and they also had historical knowledge of the industry and the business. And they ended up being extremely important in educating us as kind of crisis advisors and educating the leaders around what the community was worried about. And the other place was, there was a social channel that emerged, a Reddit channel that emerged very quickly. And all of a sudden, there were all these local people saying, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? And we use that to go back to the CEO and say, hey, you have to address this. And you can address it by saying, here's what we do know. Here is what we don't know. And to my mind, that's the thing that leaders don't do enough. They don't admit that they don't know something, because you don't become a CEO. You don't become a sitting politician. You don't become the head of an NGO without having some ego and without having some confidence in your decision making. So it's anathema for you to say, I don't know. But boy, do you gain a lot of credibility, particularly with employees and residents and third parties who don't know anything about you, when you say, you know what, right now, we don't know, but we are going to find out. And when we do, we will share with you what we can.
So I think this is really interesting, sort of bringing in the part that, talking about the local newspaper as kind of your source for education, and then also the connection between the point that we just discussed earlier, leadership and making decisions, and then communicating. It's this, you start to see this feedback loop, right? And this way of being able to communicate that really allows for real-time updates, whatever level of transparency is appropriate and allowable, and that this is what starts, right, to build trust during a crisis between private sector actors, NGOs, communities where, customers might live, or in all sorts of groups. something that I've noticed as part of my work where we do this at site is that sometimes those expectations, though, from what, for example, NGOs might be looking for or what the private sector needs, they conflict. In your experience, how have you seen sort of nonprofits, NGOs, these communities that are suddenly working together through a crisis, how do they work through these conflicting expectations and sometimes needs as well?
Sometimes they don't work that well. Sometimes NGOs and corporations and even the governmental entities don't work that well together because there is no pre-existing relationship. And I'm going to reiterate this, that building those relationships early and often make a big difference. And I think when they don't work well, that's where you really see that a crisis can take on a life of its own. Because if I, as an NGO, think my point of view is being ignored or is being dismissed, I will then take that opportunity to independently go on social media, go to the traditional press and say, these guys don't know what they're doing. They're not listening to us. They don't care about us, and they don't care about you. So then they build their allies against the corporation or against the leadership, and there's no good to come of that. So I would say kind of ignoring NGOs at your peril. It's at the same time, it's back to oil and gas, right? Trust me, trying to convince a board of an oil and gas company that they should pay attention to activist NGOs is not easy. But you have to say, look, you got to at least recognize they exist. They have a point of view. There's something that they're trying to do, and they're not always going to be at odds with you. But I will say you are right. It's not great in the middle of a crisis because people who you have as a corporation, people that you have annoyed, people that you have dismissed, are going to use this opportunity to advance their own agenda. And it may not be to your advantage.
And I think that's where, again, as we've been talking about building these relationships, right? It's so critical and so important. I think something that's really connected to that is that now, corporations, multinationals, businesses are really expected to take positions on something that happens. And it may be beyond their core operations. It may be about governance. It may be about ethics, societal challenges, and sort of related to what you're talking about. You're making decisions about when and when not to collaborate, when and when not to speak. What are the risks in either direction if you perhaps make the wrong decision not to speak, or if you make the decision to speak at the wrong time? And I'd be curious for us to be able to share, in particular with NGOs, what the risks are, so that we can get a sense of what it means when we're collaborating, private sector and organizations that are looking to support democracy and transparency.
I think that's a great question. And since we're taping this during the World Cup, I would say this often turns into an own goal. So it is one of those things where I think corporations would do well to talk to an NGO and say, I know that you have a point of view that you would like me as a leader, as a CEO, to adopt. You would like me to get out there in front of it. Let me tell you a little bit about my other stakeholders. I have customers. Some of my customers are governmental entities. I may or may not have shareholders. I have employees that run across a political spectrum. So I may not be able to be quite as outspoken as you, NGO, would like me to be, but let me just tell you kind of some of the things that I'm dealing with, and I'd love to know how you would say how you think I should respond. I think it is never as black and white, and boy, have we seen that in the last few years. You know, people have come out and it has backfired. One of the things that's interesting, I have done a lot of advising of boards, particularly around the issues around DEI, right? And we start those conversations with them by saying, how do you really feel about this? How important is taking a stand on an issue like this to you personally and to your business? And how important is it if you don't take a stand? And so it gets back to being true to your values and your mission as an organization. And I think that's where NGOs and corporations need to get together, the private-public partnerships, where we can say, what do we agree on? Where can we find common ground? And from there, we say, okay, is this worth it for us? And there are people and there are leaders that take a stand and go, this is where I am. This is what I'm doing. And, you look at somebody like a Mark Cuban, who is a great example and has, recently he's got this cost plus drugs, and he really believes in trying to make prescription medicines much more affordable for Americans, and has found some common ground with the current administration to be able to say, look, the goal is the most important thing. Let's not let everything be affected by something over here that I may not agree with.
And that's often the approach that SIPE takes, or the ACG team takes, when we're collaborating with our different partners, right? There may be lots of areas where there is no agreement. But for example, in things like forced labor, we talk about what is the thing that we build on. And then over time, it does take time. I've recently had this conversation with someone. It does take time to build that trust. But eventually at SIPE, we were able to find that we were able to bring together factories, union workers, different levels of industry together, because we've taken the time over the course of our projects to build the trust. I think that what we're seeing right now is that there's so much fragmentation, and then there are all of these sort of geopolitical things that are happening in realities that are changing from one day to the next. And I would be curious if you could share how corporations and multinationals, how they are sort of working across these different environments, and how leaders make their decisions and how they communicate during a crisis.
So I'd say the thing that I have found are the people that do the best job, the leaders who do the best job during a crisis, are the ones who take a stand and say, okay, here's what we're going to say, and here is how we're going to communicate and how often we're going to communicate. I think one of the things that gets people in trouble is and this is, I'm kind of talking my own book here, but you can't listen to every single advisor, right? Don't bring in the 5 different people. Don't ask everybody on the board. I know the board's going to be mad at this, but you don't have time. And you don't have time to try to navigate and make sure everybody's happy. What you need to do is, what are the things that got you there? What are the values that made you the leader you are? What are the things that you as an organization care about? And how do you lean into those in the middle of a crisis? And how do you say, okay, this is what we're going to do? And it's an unpopular word with some people, but the more empathetic that a leader is, the more people are going to react positively. And it's, this doesn't really go to the question that you answered, but that you asked, but I want to cite something recent that I had nothing to do with, but there was the tragedy with the Air Canada pilots and those two fellows who were killed. And, they basically gave their lives to save everybody else on the plane. And the CEO of Air Canada came out with his statement only in English. These were Quebecois, and he lost his job. And I think it was yesterday or a few days ago, as we're taping this, Air Canada has appointed a new CEO who is multilingual. And it's a simple thing, but, Canada is a bilingual country. Air Canada is a bilingual organization. These men who lost their lives were, I think, first language French-speaking Quebecois, and it was important that empathy and understanding of who they were and what they did for the company and for all the people on the plane was acknowledged. And I think it's a great example. And unfortunately, the fellow who had been the previous CEO had apparently made a big deal of saying, I don't have to learn French. Well, arrogance is not that appealing, and it's never appealing in the middle of a crisis.
So this is a really great, but I was planning to ask you about what distinguishes the leaders who can navigate these crises well versus those who don't. But I think you've given us a great example of sort of what it looks like, what sort of agility and thinking private sector actors, leaders need in order to be able to sort of navigate yourself through all sorts of things that we're seeing right now, from geopolitical turbulence to all sorts of things that happen locally within a community. This has been a really great conversation, and I want to take the time to wrap us up. And I always like to ask a question that helps us to think forward into the future, 5 to 10 years. So I'd be curious to hear what trends you believe will have the greatest impact on how organizations build resilience and how they maintain this stakeholder trust that we've been talking about.
I hate to sound like a Luddite, but it's about keeping your humanity in the face of so much technological pressure and so much technological change. The human element and the communication, the one-on-one, the one-to-many, is going to continue to be really important. And the good thing about, AI and the information that people get is that in the middle of a crisis, for example, you're going to be able to have access to historical records that say, here's what happened the last 7 times something like this happened. In the old days, that would take you 2 hours, 6 hours. Now it takes you 83 seconds, right? And so you as a leader are going to have access to that, and you're going to say, wait a minute, here's somebody who did this right. Here's what he or she took a look at. And so their humanity is going to be tested more, and their ability to be able to analyze and synthesize information and then be able to turn it into human compassion, human empathy, and human decision-making, and showing their humanity is going to be paramount. I was very lucky to work with a man in the middle of an awful crisis once, and we spent months and months and months together, and he was the CEO, and we would have these big meetings every day trying to navigate this crisis. And the lesson I learned from him was at the beginning of every meeting, he said, how are the people? And he was talking about the families of the people who had died in this incident, the families and the individuals who had been injured, and the rest of the organization. And he wanted to know every day, how are the people? Not how's the stock doing, not the nature of what was going on operationally. He started with the people. And to me, that is what distinguishes you as an exceptional leader. And, the level and the amount of information that you're going to have to synthesize as a leader over the next 5 or 10 years is staggering. But you better learn how to do it and keep your humanity.
I think that's a really great lesson for, our colleagues who may be listening, for private sector actors who may be listening, sort of how we're this important integration between information technology and how do we navigate using our basic, the human skills that we're all sort of born with. This has been a really interesting conversation. I think it really adds another layer onto the conversation that we're having about these sort of dynamic feedback loops and how do we bring the private sector and NGOs and democracy workers together to sort of think of new solutions in a new environment. I'm so grateful that you were able to be part of a previous site event and also part of this podcast. This has been really great. And I hope that all of our listeners are taking away some of the great lessons and gems that you dropped in this podcast with us today. Thanks so much, Ellen.
Thank you. Great talking to you. And I could talk to you about this for hours.
I may take you up on that. Take care.
You will.
Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise.